Well, four Russian naval ships have arrived in Havana. They're going to be there for 5 days. One of them is a frigate which has some of the latest Russian missiles on it, not nuclear, I should add. Another is a Russian submarine that is nuclear capable. It's nuclear powered and it is capable of firing nuclear cruise missiles.
Okay, Stephen. Well, I guess the first thing to say is that anytime anyone hears anything about Cuba and Russian involvement, new Cuban missile crisis is the immediate sort of concern in everyone's mind. Tell us what exactly has happened that is why we're suddenly thinking that again.
Well, four Russian naval ships have arrived in Havana. They're going to be there for 5 days. One of them is a frigate which has some of the latest Russian missiles on it, not nuclear, I should add. Another is a Russian submarine that is nuclear capable. It's nuclear powered and it is capable of firing nuclear cruise missiles. The Cubans have been pretty clear because of exactly what you said, that they're worried about sort of alarmist reaction to this. They're pretty clear that there are no nuclear weapons on any of those vessels. But it is these are complex times. This is a time when Russia and the West are having a pretty fraught relationship, and there is Cuba, probably the closest ally of Russia in the Western Hemisphere, and just 90 miles from the United States. So, clear parallels are being drawn. But as I say, the Cuban government are sort of adamant that one shouldn't blow this out of proportion.
What is America's sort of current stance on its relationship with Cuba? Have things changed at all over the last 4 years of Joe Biden?
Not really. I mean, it's not to sort of step back a bit. Under Trump, the sanctions were ramped up. There's been an embargo on Cuba since the 1960s. Those were somewhat ramped up under Trump, and there was some hope on the Cuban side that they would be sort of scaled back. They have been a bit. Things like remittances are easier to make again. But no, it's a pretty difficult relationship, and there are many reasons why. One of them is that there is demand from some American voters, particularly in Florida, to take a hard line on Cuba, and the Democrat Party continues to do that. And the Biden administration will say the Cuban government needs to give a bit if it wants a better relationship. It, for example, has imprisoned almost 1,000 people who protested against the government a couple of years ago. So yeah, it continues to be a difficult relationship.
I imagine another area they could give a bit would be step back from this relationship with Russia, which since the start of the Ukraine war has actually got slightly tighter, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this has been extraordinary to watch, really. I mean, right at the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Cuba in sort of events like at the United Nations, it tended to abstain. It tried to have a neutral position. But actually, what's happened in the last few months is it's had a much closer position. The president of Cuba went to Moscow just a few weeks ago, and there he said, to Putin's face, we absolutely support the Russian military operation. You have, Cuba's total backing. Which in a way, this is how politics works. But it is a bit surprising if you take the view, of course, that Russia has invaded a sovereign nation, and there is Cuba, which has long pushed its sort of anti-imperialist line. Apparently supporting the invasion of a neighbor. But of course, the Cuban government would frame it in a very different way, and say that the whole war was a result of NATO expansion, etc., etc. And of course, that is exactly what they do. But the real reason is that Cuba needs Russia right now. Cuba needs oil. I'm speaking to you from Venezuela, which does provide quite a lot of oil to Cuba, but not quite as much as it used to. And there have been big power cuts in Cuba. Its economy is in a real trouble. So Cuba finds its friends wherever it can, and one key one, in the current situation, is Russia.
So, what are we to believe about this flotilla then of Russia's going into Cuba? The messaging from Cuba you've already spoken about. America doesn't appear to be too concerned, but would you look at it and think, is this Russia, I guess, testing the water with America?
I think it's a sort of Russia pointing out that it's not in a corner. It can exert its power sort of wherever it wants, and in a place that's right on the doorstep of the United States. This isn't a it's not a massive display of power. This is a frigate, a submarine, a tug, and a sort of tanker boat. So it's not the Russian sort of Red Fleet of the Cold War being back, but it is definitely a message. And the Russian or Moscow will repeatedly say, this is what the United States does the whole time. It does naval drills all over the world. So does China. So do all the great powers. But it is, as I say, it's a message that there will be people in the United States that would hope that in this region everyone is on the US side, but of course they're not. It's not just Cuba. There's also Nicaragua and here in Venezuela, and we do expect. It hasn't been confirmed, but it's quite likely that the Russian naval flotilla will come to Venezuela too after its stay in Cuba.
And what does your average Joe on the street, or should I say Joao on the street of Cuba think? I would imagine if they need oil and they ain't getting any help from America, they'll take it where it comes from. They must be fairly satisfied if Russia are coming to their aid, are they?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think there is a definitely sort of friendship, a feeling of friendship in Cuba towards Russia. This is a country that they forged extremely close ties during the Soviet period. It all sort of went horribly wrong at the end, but that doesn't mean that Cubans don't like Russians. Many Cubans have Russian names. Many Cubans drive larders. There have in recent years, like the last couple of years, been a whole lot of Russian tourists who've been going to Cuba. So no, I don't think there's any sort of animosity or really sort of fear in Cuba about this Russian presence. But I think there's a degree of realism too that Cuba has repeatedly hoped to find a foreign savior in a way. It has been quite reliant on outside powers to get it through its own difficulties, and repeatedly, it's worked for a bit, but not forever. So there are also plenty of people in Cuba saying, somehow we need to get our act together, despite all the problems we've got, and of course, the US embargo being one key part of that. But no, I think when I was last in Havana, you did notice quite a strong Russian presence, particularly these tourists, and things like Russian the menus in certain restaurants, etc., are in Russian. So no question, they are welcome. And in fact, as I'm speaking to you, I've just been seeing some images just before I spoke to you of quite a few Cubans gathering on the Havana sort of seafront to watch the arrival of these ships, and shortly there's going to be a 21 cannon salute, we hear.
And just finally, you've talked about how this not being a massive show of strength by Russia, but it is a message. What would it take for Russia to sort of send in this direction that would then start American concerns, I guess?
I think one of the things the US has been keeping an eye on, and this doesn't just apply to Russia, but also China, is any evidence of a sort of more permanent military presence in Cuba and elsewhere in this region. That's something that they're very sensitive about. Now, of course, you have to sort of see it from both sides, and of course, Cuba will mention that there is a U.S. base on Cuban territory in Guantanamo Bay, but uh, that is, as I say, what the United States has been sort of digging around a bit, looking at. There were some stories that possibly China had set up an intelligence base in Cuba. Probably that came to nothing, but if those ships sail away, I think the United States will be pretty relaxed. But if there's a sign of anything more permanent, then things do change.